Hi, and thanks for joining. My name is Sarah Lawless, and the research I'm presenting today is part of my PhD. So this research was inspired during my time working with various environmental governance organisations who had made commitments to address gender issues within their work. And I saw some important challenges that policymakers and implementers were facing, which led me to develop this body of work. So there's been an increase in gender equality commitments made within environmental policies and programs. Many of these are seeking to align with the Sustainable Development Goals and the goal of gender equality specifically. For example, within major global environmental agencies, gender equality features as a key thematic program of work, for instance, within the IUCN. And we're also seeing this level of commitment in food systems, for example, within the small-scale fisheries sector, which is the focus of much of my work. The main guiding instrument is the small-scale fisheries guidelines, and they have dedicated commitments to gender equality and women's empowerment. And these commitments are not just occurring at these global levels, but we're also seeing commitments at regional and national levels of governance also. So essentially the integration of gender equality in environmental policies within environmental practice follows this basic assumption that if policy commitments to gender equality are made, this will lead to more equitable practice and ultimately make progress towards gender equality. However, recent research suggests that even when gender is considered, progress towards gender equality is not necessarily guaranteed. A review of over $6 billion of gender equality investments, which included 72 independent projects, found that none of the projects were considered high quality and only 2 were considered to meet minimum standards or minimum criteria to be considered a gender equality project. So this evidence raises serious concerns about whether this assumption on the screen here actually holds true. So there's a gap in our understanding about whether environmental policies and practices are actually making progress towards equality. So we're seeing these gender commitments on paper, but when implemented, are they actually creating impact? So I explored this gap using small-scale fisheries as my case, as it's an important food system, which has seen a rapid increase in gender commitments in the past decade. My geographic focus was the Pacific Islands region, where small-scale fisheries are a vital source of food and nutrition security, but also a foundation for sustainable livelihoods, and they're obviously very closely tied with human well-being. So I look at small-scale fisheries policies and practices across the region, but I also focused in on 3 nations specifically, those being Fiji, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands, as arguably they have the highest density of fisheries actors and fisheries-related investments in these countries. So my policy sample included 76 influential gender and fisheries policies to understand written commitments to gender equality. And my practice sample included interviews with 34 different small-scale fisheries organisations to understand the actions taken to address gender inequality. So these organisations varied in type. They range from donors to non-governmental organisations to civil society organisations. And I stratified my sample to ensure I captured organisations operating at both regional and national levels of governance. So for my data collection, within my policy sample specifically, I saw small-scale fisheries documents that provided some guidance around gender integration. And in terms of practice, I interviewed 80 key informants who self-identified as either a small-scale fisheries or gender expert. And I sought a male and female from each organisation to ensure a gender balanced sample. And these informants occupied a range of positions from executives to officers, to fisheries officers and field staff. So I first examined these policy instruments for definitions of gender, and this generated more than 5,000 references. So I found that within policy instruments, overwhelmingly gender was this focus on women and really used language that indicated an understanding of gender as a social construct. So addressing gender essentially meant fixing women. focusing on delivering livelihood projects to women or inviting them to meetings, rather than focusing on the cultural, political, and organisational structures and norms that underpin these inequalities in the first place. I also found some reluctance to actually use the term gender at all. For example, within a donor guide for gender proposals, the donor suggested to avoid the overuse of the word gender throughout project documents, as this may disengage people. A clever tactic is to use gender responsive terms without directly using the word gender or gender equality at all. So this suggests that there were efforts to try and bury gender so that language would not be off-putting. And this can be at times a deliberate strategy to enable the concept of gender to be more easily integrated within fisheries policy agendas. And this is a phenomenon that we call gender masking in this paper. But we also warn that this skirting around the edges of gender is likely to compromise equality-focused outcomes. So I then examined how gender was rationalised to get an understanding of the motivations of fisheries actors in pursuing gender equality in the first place. So I found that in 75% of cases, gender was framed instrumentally, where gender was promoted to achieve or enhance environmental management outcomes. And in many cases, gender was seen as important because there was this belief that conservation outcomes would be enhanced if women were participating in management. In the other 25% of cases, gender was pursued through this intrinsic frame where gender equality was considered to ensure fair and just outcomes. So essentially, this frame viewed gender equality as a fundamental human right, which should be pursued as an outcome in and of itself. So basically, the difference between the two is that the instrumental frame views gender as a means to another end, whereas the intrinsic frame views gender as an end to itself. So within these two broad categories, I found 16 distinct rationale for pursuing gender equality. And at the top, you can see all the different instrumental objectives. The most common framing or motivation was to improve conservation or environmental outcomes. And in contrast, I found evidence of objectives considered intrinsic in their framing at the bottom. So an example was to ensure equitable benefits from coastal fisheries. So just to show this result in a different form, I also analysed these objectives based on the author or producers of these documents. So on the left are the different author types, and on the right are the objectives for pursuing gender. And I found that virtually all organisational types embrace this instrumental framing of gender. So now let's look at commitments to gender equality in practice. So for this research, I drew more heavily on the key informant interviews, and I asked each informant to provide a detailed description of a fisheries initiative that they had been involved in that had considered gender. And I asked them to reflect on their organisation's gender actions, describe the actual approaches that were taken, and provide an evaluation of a transform typology. And essentially there's three analytical categories that I have a series of criteria embedded within them. But for simplicity's sake, the Tinker category basically seeks for women to be added into male-dominated spaces. So there's no real consideration of the different barriers that women might face in accessing or having any power in these domains. The Taylor typology looks to ensure that gender differences are considered and worked around. And whilst this is an important step, they're not exactly seen to challenge or make meaningful progress towards gender equality. And the transform approaches seek to displace unequal gender norms, relations, and structures. So this approach really gets the root causes underpinning inequalities and seeks to transform them. And as we know, this is considered the frontier of gender best practice. So we're seeing around half of all approaches in this fairly large sample are doing the bare minimum to consider gender. So the definition of a Tinker approach was the inclusion of women in spaces traditionally occupied or dominated by men. A common example was to ensure that equal numbers of men and women are invited to meetings and workshops. So really in these cases, we are just looking at getting women in the room. There's very little attempt to actually address some of the barriers they might be facing. And with this approach, there's definitely no guarantee that women's voices will be heard or they'll have any influence in decisions made within or after that particular meeting. So for the tailor approaches, a common example was to tailor livelihood options because women's interests might be different to men's. Women target different habitat areas like mangroves. So in this example, there was a clear acknowledgement that women's and men's interests, livelihood activities, and access to natural resources may differ. And lastly, there were very few approaches that fit the transform criteria, but one example was that an organisation undertook a series of gender transformative activities to help the staff apply gender lens to their own lives. So this organisation was applying a transformative approach within their own internal organisation to look at changing mindsets. So I then looked at the actual depth of these impacts of these particular fisheries initiatives. And again, we're seeing this skew to the lower end of the typology. An example of an impact considered to only tinker with gender was that a particular organisation has taken more women on board in terms of employment. There is more of a gender balance in staff, but the women, are mainly doing data entry. So in this case, there was a reported growth in female employees, which suggests progress. However, they were confined to lower level roles where assumingly they had very little agency to make decisions or wield much power or leadership influence. And there were actually no examples of approaches that we found transformative, and only 10%, and of those 10% were too early to tell. But what is of concern is that 17% of approaches reportedly led to no changes. A policy specialist reported, "We don't know how to do it. We've never been trained. We don't know how to integrate gender in our work." So there's a clear lack of capacity to make progress, but also a number of empty efforts. Whether this is intentional or not, these intentions around gender are not being matched with impact. So what we established from this research that the vast majority of gender approaches in both policy and pursued in practice are neither meeting or advancing gender best practice frontiers. So there's this strong focus on inclusion of women without changing the structures, norms, and attitudes that shape inequalities. And as a result, they tend to be quite limited in their influence. So gender equality tends to be diluted in small-scale fisheries policy and practice. And my results really emphasize that framing matters. So in conceptualization, so we did identify some opportunities to move away from these shallow approaches and seemingly rhetorical responses to gender. So firstly, in framing, this might mean organisations questioning their dominant narratives for pursuing gender. Are they only wanting to see improved environmental outcomes, or is there also value in creating equitable and just social outcomes too? In terms of impact, before a project even begins, it is possible to predict the depth and potential impacts of planned gender approaches. So tools such as the Tinker, Tailor, Transform typology could be useful in situating gender approaches and undertaking gender analysis. And with that, I think my time is up. So if you're interested in hearing more about this research or collaborating, please feel free to get in touch with me. My details are there. So thanks for joining.